Ohio is not a state which you would typically associate Bigfoot with, or anything else interesting, really, for that matter. But one of my favorite Bigfoot stories happened in Ohio. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, accounts of a gorilla or wild man kept popping up in Ohio newspapers. Accounts predate 1869 and continue after 1930, but that's the relevant time period for my purposes here. There are too many reports to go through them all, but I will highlight a few. The Gazette reported that in New Lisbon, Ohio, two hunters, Bradley and Rausch, pursued what they called a wild man, quote, covered in hair looking like a bear. They saw a huge hairy object, apparently half man and half beast, spring from behind a cliff and start for the woods running with great speed. That was reported in 1869. In 1886, the newspaper entitled Progress reported on the experience of some hunters in Holmes County, Ohio. The men called it a wild man or something strange. The hunters claim it looked like a man but acted like a beast. They described the wild man as entirely nude with matted hair and making queer guttural sounds. When they approached it, it, quote, plunged into the river and crossed in a similar manner to a dog. That article was called The Wild Man of Ohio. In 1883, the Ohio Daily Advocate described a, quote, gorilla over 6 feet tall as only covering a mat of long curly hair. That was near Rome, Ohio. This is a sketch done by a witness in Rome from 1981. In 1904, the Ohio Advocate reported that a, quote, wild man who haunts the woods is at large, as fleet as a deer, and can outpace the swiftest hounds and their masters. In April 1902, in the area between Rockport and Beaver Dam, a prowler is paying residents nightly visits. Quote, it was the scheme of the prowler to attempt to open a window or fumble with the locks, shake the gates and walls, and then disappear as quickly as he came. Frank Cockelman and his family left their rural home and never came back after seeing a man possessing of features rough and coarse and covered with hair. The article says that a search party to capture the man would be fruitless because of the man's, quote, fleetness of foot and fence jumping abilities. The article says that residents attest that this is perhaps an escaped insane person. And then between 1902 and 1930, there are literally dozens of articles about an escaped ape, presumably a gorilla, and the type of gorilla that's over 6 feet tall and walks on two legs. The reports themselves are not what make this case unique or special. The Bigfoot world is filled with stories of people seeing tall, hairy, man-like things running through the woods or prowling around houses at night. What is unique and compelling about the story is how the media framed it and then how people received it. See, if this happened in Florida or the Pacific Northwest, natives would have said, oh, that was a Sasquatch, or wow, sounds like you saw a skookum. And that's exactly why this case is so compelling. This is one of the few instances where people fundamentally had no idea what they were looking at. In all other historical sightings, natives were there to answer the question of what the hell are we seeing, or what left these footprints. It's only natural that people would have asked the natives. People always seek answers from someone who has been there longer. However, Ohio was one of the states where Indian removals eradicated native populations. Sadly, even today there are no federally recognized tribes, reservations, or significant native populations in Ohio. So by 1900, there was no native lore and no one to tell it. I guarantee that if there were Native Americans in Ohio or even near Ohio, there would have been none of this wild man or gorilla talk. They would have known what it was. They would have known what they were looking at. So you can't call Bigfoot a native legend because people were still seeing it and reporting it when there were no natives to propagate the legend. We are seeing two entirely different and separate cultures report the same thing with different words and no communication, no transfer of knowledge. This would not happen if the subject was fictional. It is impossible. And we didn't even know what to call them. Gorilla, escaped crazy person, the wild man? So if Sasquatch was not in the people's language, what were they going to call it? Well, they knew it was giant, man-like, and hairy, so that leaves wild man and gorilla. And it is very unlikely that people were seeing a gorilla because the lowland gorilla was not even verified by modern Western science until 1847. After the species was verified in 1847, many attempts were made to capture and bring gorillas to the US for profit. There were only a few successfully retrieved gorillas, the first being in 1855. Literally none of them survived longer than a month after arriving to the US. This is due to the gorilla being able to contract human diseases but having no ability to fight them. Improper diet, and I would guess the largest factor, stress, also led to the death of captive gorillas between 1855 and 1925. Well-respected zoologist William Temple Hornaday said in 1915 that, quote, there is not the slightest reason to hope that a gorilla, male or female, will ever be seen living in a zoological park or garden. It seems unlikely that a gorilla could survive the trip from Africa to the East Coast, then in a circus to Ohio, and then in the wilderness of Ohio in 1901, when a zoologist said in 1915 that we would never even be able to keep a gorilla alive ever. The articles weren't even describing a gorilla, really. People in 1897 probably had never even seen an actual gorilla. Articles called the gorilla over 6 feet tall and described a biped. Neither descriptions match a gorilla. Closest would be the mountain gorilla, which was not even verified by Westerners until 1903, 5 years after. So gorilla is out. Next is wild man. This obviously was no wild man. Being wild does not give you superhuman strength, which is described in the articles. If anything, a wild human would be malnourished and weak, and anything but, quote, unfindable to search parties and dogs. Being wild also does not naturally cover you in, quote, long matted hair, as is also described in the articles. I mean, these people had no idea what they were seeing, and they were trying to categorize it because that's what we as human beings do. To me, it really seems like people were reporting things that there simply was not a name for, something that their language didn't have a word for, but others did. So that's what I think. Let me know what you think, and thanks a lot for listening.